Britain versus China, 1839. The First Opium War. This is the story of how a trade in poison brought two proud empires to the edge of collapse. Night hangs over the Pearl River like smoke. In the harbor at Canton, British ships sit heavy in the water, their holds packed not with tea or silk, but with wooden chests stamped with a single word that China has begun to fear: opium. By this moment in history, more than 40,000 such chests are flooding into the Qing Empire every year, draining its silver, hollowing its people from the inside. On the shore, lanterns flicker along the foreign factories, where merchants count their profits in quiet rooms, pretending not to hear the coughing in the opium dens beyond their walls. Inside the imperial city, reports pile up on polished desks, soldiers selling their weapons for one more pipe, officials unable to stand without trembling, silver pouring out of China like water through broken stone, and somewhere between these two worlds, between the British, cannon in the bay, and the crumbling dignity of the Qing court, a single imperial commissioner is being handed a sealed decree. What he is about to do in this city of smoke and silence will set fire to the century. He has one choice. The British have another. Only one side can afford to be wronged. Now the opium must be stopped, or the empire must bleed. The empire that refused to bend crept across the walls of the forbidden city with the color of old bone, pale and cold, as if the sun itself hesitated to disturb the silence within. Ministers moved through the marble courtyards with lowered eyes, sleeves brushing stone, each man carrying the weight of messages they wished they did not have to deliver. Every report told the same story, though none dared say it aloud. The empire was decaying from within, and it was doing so quietly enough that pride still believed it stood tall. One petition thin, trembling, written in the hand of a provincial governor, lay open before the Daguang emperor. It spoke of soldiers collapsing on duty, farmers selling daughters to feed an addiction, silver leaving the empire faster than grain from a broken sack. He reread the final line, though he already knew it by heart. If this continues, the foundation of the dynasty will not endure another generation. A soft gust stirred the window screens, carrying with it a faint hum from the city beyond, merchants calling prices, wheels grinding against stone, the distant clang of harbor chains. Life went on, but in the emperor's mind, that sound felt like the low, steady groan of a structure beginning to crack. He had seen the maps. He had listened to his generals speak of British ships that could move without wind, guns that did not need reloading after every shot. Yet he could not understand how such forces had entered China not with armies, but with a drug that whispered its way into hearts and lungs. Losing a battle was one thing. Losing the will of a people was something far more dangerous. That morning, he summoned a man whose name had become a quiet promise within the court: Lin Zexu. Lin entered the hall of mental cultivation with the calm of a man who felt the weight of history settling across his shoulders and did not flinch. His eyes were steady, his robe was simple, and his resolve, sharp as steel, seemed to shift the air around him. The emperor handed him the decree without ceremony. Absolute authority. A single mission. End the opium trade. No negotiation. No compromise. The emperor studied Lin's face for any sign of hesitation. He found none. Only a controlled breath, as if Lin were bracing himself for a storm that had not yet broken by the time he left the palace. The first threads of tension had already begun weaving through the corridors. Some ministers approved. Others feared. A few whispered that confronting foreign merchants would provoke something the empire was not prepared to face. Lin heard the whispers. He kept walking. Far to the south, Canton moved with a rhythm of its own. Barges drifted along the Pearl River. Market stalls spilled over with spices and lacquered wares. But beneath its noise, a different pulse beat a quieter, hungrier one dot in alleyways near the docks. Men with hollowed cheeks leaned over small lamps, the sweet, sickly smell of smoke curling from their pipes. Their eyes were glassy, their breaths shallow. A young soldier sat among them, uniform undone, head drooping as if sleep had conquered him. His rifle lay on the floor beside him. No one picked it up. The merchants within the foreign factories pretended not to see any of this. They shut their doors at night, counted their earnings, and told themselves that trade was trade and choices were choices. Morality, after all, was not listed on any ledger. When Lin Zexu arrived in Canton, the city barely seemed to notice. A few riders, a few banners. No grand parade, no public announcement. The foreign traders continued with business. The Chinese officials continued with excuses. And the addicts continued with their slow descent. But something shifted the moment. Lin stepped into the Governor-General's compound. Every official who met him felt it. A quiet intensity. A controlled fire beneath calm words. Lin did not threaten. He simply reminded them of the emperor's command and of the cost of defiance. Truthfully, he did not need to remind them of anything at all. His presence alone made men straighten their backs and choose their words with care. For 3 days, Lin observed Canton without intervening. He walked the streets at dawn, watched the harbor from the cliffs, and stood outside opium dens without stepping inside. He wanted to feel the rhythm of the city, its breath, its pulse, its hidden fractures. On the 4th morning, he summoned the foreign merchants. They entered the meeting hall with stiff collars and confident expressions, speaking English among themselves as if the walls were deaf. Some wore smirks. They had seen Chinese officials before, men who bowed, men who debated, men who accepted small gifts and allowed large shipments to pass unchallenged. Lin sat at the center of the hall, posture still, gaze level. A single scroll lay before him. He said nothing at first. The merchants waited. And then, with a voice soft enough to unsettle every man in the room, he offered them the simplest possible choice: surrender every chest of opium they possessed, or bear full responsibility for the suffering of the empire. The room stiffened. The merchants glanced at one another, waiting for someone else to speak. Several attempted polite defiance. Others tried to frame the issue as trade, economics, freedom. One man nervously mentioned the rights of British subjects. Lin listened to every word. He gave no reaction. When the final voice fell silent, he lifted the imperial decree and unrolled it slowly, letting the weight of the seal catch the light. The merchants leaned closer. The document was short, a message unmistakable. No opium. No negotiations. A tremor of unease passed through the room. The merchants realized too late that the man before them was not interested in compromise, nor in maintaining the polite fiction that opium was merely another commodity. Lin dismissed them with a gesture. Not brusque, not cruel. Simply final. By the time they reached the factories, the foreign settlement buzzed with tension. Rumors spread like sparks, leaping from one roof to another. Was he bluffing? Did he intend arrests? Would Chinese troops surround the compound? No one knew. As night deepened, lanterns along the shoreline flickered against the water, throwing long shadows beneath the ships. The tide was low, the air thick. A storm hovered somewhere beyond the horizon. Its winds not yet arrived. In the half-silence of the foreign factories, men paced narrow rooms, scribbled urgent letters, and weighed the risk of resisting a man backed by the throne of China itself. Just as the tension settled into a fragile stillness, a messenger arrived at Lin Zexu's residence with word that would snap every thread of calm. The foreign merchants had made their decision, and it was the one choice Lin had hoped they would not dare make. He stood very still as the messenger finished speaking. The candle beside him flickered once, throwing his shadow across the wall like a dark wave. The storm he had been waiting for was finally on its way, and the first flash of anger from across the sea had not yet even begun. Smoke, silver, and the British Lion. The first letters reached London wrapped in the damp smell of the sea, carried by ships that had left Canton months before Lin Zexu ever stepped into the governor's compound. They spoke of disagreements, rising tension, and a commissioner unlike any China had sent before. But letters alone rarely stirred the British Empire. Prophets did, and those had begun trembling. Inside a counting house along Leadenhall Street, a merchant sat with both hands flat on the ledger in front of him, as if steadying himself. Columns of numbers glowed in the lamplight. Opium shipments delayed. Payments withheld. A whisper that the Chinese intended to seize everything. He tried to convince himself it was rumor, nothing more. But beneath his waistcoat, a bead of sweat slid down his spine. The British economy had many strengths, but its trade with China had always been one-sided. Tea flowed in one direction, silver in the other. Opium was the balance. Without it, the books did not add up. Without it, the East India Company's grip on India would tighten into a chokehold. Every man in that counting house understood the stakes long before Parliament did. Across the city, smoke curled above chimneys in Westminster, as lawmakers debated the matter with the calm of men who rarely felt the consequences of their decisions. Some argued that opium was a moral stain. Others insisted that trade was the empire's lifeblood. But the loudest voices were those who warned that allowing China to dictate terms would fracture Britain's prestige. It is not about the drug, one MP said, his voice carrying over the chamber. It is about the principle of free trade. If we yield here, every port in Asia will follow China's example. Another replied quietly, if we push too far, we may find ourselves at war. The chamber murmured. But the louder argument, the one that grew like rising flame, was that war might not be a risk at all. It might be an opportunity. None of them knew yet what Lin Zexu had done in Canton. They still believed they held time in their fists, not far from Westminster. Aboard a British frigate slicing through the Indian Ocean, a young officer leaned on the railing and watched the moon spill across the water like silver poured from a broken ingot. He carried with him a copy of the latest dispatches, folded and refolded until the edges softened. He had read them so often he could recite them from memory. A Chinese commissioner with unprecedented authority. An ultimatum issued to foreign traders. The possibility of confiscation. The threat of imprisonment. The officer closed his eyes. His father had served in India. His grandfather in the Caribbean. Their letters spoke of battles, forts, and the dust of distant lands. His would likely speak of China. But something about these dispatches unnerved him. Not because of China's power. Britain believed itself unmatched, but because China seemed to be acting from a certainty that made resistance feel inevitable. He wondered what that commissioner was like. In Canton, the foreign merchants had chosen defiance. Not loudly, not bravely, but through hesitation, through the belief that the British flag, even so far from home, would shield them from consequences. When Lin Zexu learned of their decision, he felt no anger, only resolve. He ordered the factory sealed. Guards surrounded the compound, not with the chaos of an angry mob, but with the steady precision of a force that had been waiting for this moment. No merchant could leave. No ship could unload cargo. No opium could disappear into the river. Days passed under a tense sky. Inside the factories, British traders paced narrow halls, arguing in hushed voices. Some demanded resistance. Others begged caution. One man, older than the rest, leaned against the window and watched the lanterns glimmering along the riverbank. He will force our hand, he whispered. He knows exactly what he is doing. The younger merchants didn't understand, but the older man did. Lin Zexu was not trying to negotiate. He was drawing a line so sharp it could cut through illusions. Another knock came at the factory gates. A messenger. Another demand. The response was the same. Delay, reluctance, a plea for time. Lin offered none, but beneath his resolve lay a quiet urgency. He read the merchants clearly. They were waiting for a signal from Britain, a signal that could arrive at any moment, a signal that could shatter everything. And then, amid the standoff, news arrived that shifted the ground beneath both sides. One British captain, frustrated with the blockade, attempted to land supplies by force. Chinese guards intercepted him. A scuffle, shouting. A single shot fired into the night. No one died, but the echo of that gunshot reached farther than any bullet. Lin Zexu stood over the report. The characters brushed in hurried strokes. To some, it was a minor incident. To others, the first spark in a field of dry grass. He closed the scroll carefully, but his breath had turned heavier. He knew how foreign nations use such moments. He had studied their conflicts. One shot could become justification for an entire war. That night, a storm finally rolled in from the sea. Rain lashed the river. Thunder shook the shutters. The foreign factories lay dark, except for a single lantern flickering behind shuttered windows. Inside, the merchants sat around a long table, their faces pale in the lantern's glow. One man broke the silence. "We cannot keep this up. If we surrender the opium, we lose everything." Another replied, "If we don't, China will take it anyway. And then Britain will come." "And what? We hide behind the guards and hope we survive?" The room turned still. It was then that the oldest merchant, the one who had watched the lanterns earlier, spoke in a voice that trembled despite his effort to steady it. "You don't understand him. That commissioner, he isn't bluffing. We are not dealing with the usual officials. He will not bend. Not even a finger." "You speak as if he already won," someone snapped. "No," the older man said. "He is convinced we already lost." The lantern sputtered, then steadied again. Outside the window, shadows moved along the riverbank. Chinese guards stood silent, their robes soaked with rain, their stance unwavering. The city beyond seemed to hold its breath. The next morning arrived clearer than expected. The storm had passed. The streets glistened. And Lin Zexu, dressed in a robe still damp at the hem from his walk along the river, sent one final message: surrender the opium. Today, without delay. The merchants gathered again, this time with fear clinging to them like smoke. They realized that resistance would not bring rescue. Britain was still weeks, perhaps months away from even learning the truth of what was happening. And finally, reluctantly, with hands shaking over inkstones, they yielded. They promised to hand over every chest. Word reached Lin before noon that he closed his eyes for a long breath. Relief did not come. Only the knowledge that the hardest part had just begun. He had won the standoff. But in winning it, he had set something much larger into motion. Because not far away, farther than Canton, farther than India, beyond the seas and the monsoon, winds the letters carrying news of his victory were already being loaded onto ships bound for London. And when Britain learned that a Chinese commissioner had compelled British subjects to surrender their goods, something deep in the empire would stir awake, something that believed prestige mattered more than justice. Something that had cannons, steamships, and the pride of a lion. Lin Zexu stood at the edge of the harbor that evening, watching the fading glow of the sun against the water. The city behind him was quiet, too quiet, as if waiting for a response carried by the tide. The surrendered opium had not yet been destroyed. The foreign merchants had not yet accepted what the consequences of this day would become, and on the distant horizon, a ship approached, its sails still too small to read, its flag still unseen, but Lin felt it, a presence, an arrival. A shift in the wind that warned him the confrontation he feared was already on its way. He turned from the water, the first hints of unease tightening his breath, aware that this calm would not last. Not after what he had forced the British to do, and certainly not after what he was about to do next. When tea turned to blood, the morning the opium was taken from the foreign factories, a thin mist drifted over the Pearl River, softening the edges of ships and rooftops until they seemed like shadows cast by a waking world. Canton felt suspended, caught between triumph and dread, between what had ended and what was about to begin. Lin Zexu stood at the riverbank before sunrise, his breath quiet in the cool air. Behind him stretched rows of confiscated chests, stacked like crude monuments to human weakness. More than 20,000 by count, though the numbers barely captured the weight of destruction they had brought to China. He traced his gaze across the surface of the water, imagining the empire's silver sinking through its depths, drained to pay for addiction. Yet even here, amid what should have been victory, a subtle tension clung to him. Victory without peace was only a resting point. A messenger approached at a brisk pace, bowing before speaking. The foreign merchants had requested another meeting, urgent, anxious, a plea for reconsideration. Lin's jaw tightened. He already knew what they wanted. Once the chests were destroyed, Britain would have no material claim to hide behind. Only humiliation. Only outrage. He had expected their desperation. He had not expected how quickly it would surface. "Tell them I will meet them," Lin said, but he did not hurry. He walked the long path toward the Governor-General's compound with measured steps, feeling the city drift awake around him. Street vendors lit their fires. Fishermen pulled in their nets. A child chased a stray dog between wooden stalls. Life went on as if the world were not shifting beneath their feet. Inside the compound, the British merchants waited, their faces drawn tight. Their spokesperson, a tall man with a brow that always seemed clenched, stepped forward as Lin entered. "You must understand," he began, struggling for breath. "If these goods are destroyed, Britain will answer. We cannot return home having allowed this." Lin listened without expression. He noticed the trembling in the man's hands. Fear had begun to take root. "Your nation may answer," Lin replied. "But this act, this poison, is something China can no longer endure." The merchant's voice rose. "You speak as if we wanted this trade." Lin's gaze hardened. "Did you not?" A silence fell so complete that the rustle of bamboo outside the window became sharp enough to cut through air. The merchant tried to muster a defense, but words tangled in his throat. Lin dismissed them with a quiet firmness, knowing no conversation would avert what history had already chosen. That afternoon, he sent orders to Human. The opium would be destroyed. Not burned, that would release its fumes, but dissolved in salt water and lime until it became nothing more than foul sludge carried out to sea. The announcement rippled through Canton. Some celebrated. Some feared. Some whispered that this was the moment foreign nations would rise in fury. But Lin did not waver. At Human, along a wide stretch of riverbank, trenches had been dug. Workers moved with steady purpose, hauling chest after chest to the edge. Soldiers watched with spears planted firmly in the ground. Curious villagers gathered at a distance, unsure whether they were witnessing justice or the first blow of something darker. Lin arrived at midday. The sky hung low with heavy clouds. A hush fell as he stepped forward, his robe brushing the earth. The workers broke open the first chest. A stinging, bitter smell rose into the air. The paste inside clung to the wooden edges like rot. As lime was poured and water churned, The mixture hissed violently, releasing thick plumes of smoke that made eyes sting and lungs ache. People covered their mouths. Soldiers blinked against the burn. But Lin stood unmoving, watching as the poison melted into nothing. Chest after chest was opened. 100, 200, 500. The sound of cracking wood echoed across the river, rhythmic, relentless, like the heartbeat of the moment itself. Hours passed, and the clouds began to break. Sunlight caught the swirling water, turning it into a churn of gray and gold. A sense of solemn ceremony settled over the crowd, something between purification and burial. Among the onlookers, a British captain stood stiffly, his fists clenched at his sides. He had been allowed to witness, but not intervene. His jaw twitched as he understood the magnitude of what was happening. This was not seizure. This was annihilation. One chest struck a stone as it was dragged, shattering into a spray of splinters. The opium spilled out in a dark, sticky mass. A soldier recoiled instinctively. The captain inhaled sharply. Lin watched the captain closely. Their eyes met only for a moment, but it was enough. The captain understood then that this act was not born of anger. It was conviction. And conviction is far more dangerous. As the destruction continued, villagers murmured among themselves. Some praised Lin as a savior. Others feared this would provoke disaster. A fisherman near the water's edge said softly, "If Britain comes with warships, what can we do against thunder and iron?" No one answered. By late afternoon, the sky dimmed again. Workers' hands shook from exhaustion. Soldiers blinked against the sting of lime. But the chests kept coming, endless, like a parade of ghosts. Then, just as another chest was dragged forward, the sound of a horn cut through the air sharp, urgent, carrying across the river with a tone that made men straighten and glance toward the water. A ship was approaching, not one of the foreign merchant vessels, not a riverboat. This one flew a different banner. Chinese officials hurried forward, murmuring to one another with rising concern. Lin stepped toward the edge of the river. His eyes narrowing, the ship pulled closer, its hull darkened by travel, its sails stiff with salt. As it came within sight, a messenger leaned over the railing, waving a scroll tightly bound with red cord. "Commissioner Lin," the messenger called, voice straining across the water. "A dispatch from Beijing." Lin's pulse shifted. He descended the riverbank with unhurried steps, though the air around him vibrated with growing tension. Soldiers made way. Workers paused. The British captain watched intently, sensing a shift that could alter the balance of everything. The scroll was handed to Lin with both hands. He broke the seal and unrolled it under the muted light. The characters inside were bold, written with urgency. The emperor praised his efforts. The court supported his actions. But behind the formal tone lay something sharper, more fragile. A warning. Foreign nations were watching. The court was divided. And in London, outrage had begun to spread. Lin folded the scroll, but his mind tightened around the final lines. The emperor urged him to remain resolute, yet also cautious. A contradiction, a symptom of fear. The destruction continued into evening, but something had shifted. The workers felt it. The soldiers felt it. Even the villagers sensed the silent unease spreading through the ranks. And when the last chest of the day was emptied into the churning trenches, the water hissed like an angry serpent. The smell hung heavy, dense enough to cling to skin. A few men coughed violently. The British captain turned away, unable to watch further. Lin dismissed the workers to rest. But he did not leave. He walked to the far end of the trench, where the river met the open sea. The water pulled at the sludge, carrying it outward, dispersing it into the vastness beyond. He stood there long after the others had gone, listening to the dusk settle around him. Then faintly, from somewhere upriver, He heard it, the distant beat of drums, slow, deliberate, echoing across the water like a warning carried by the tide. He turned toward the sound, breath steady, but a knot forming at the base of his throat. The drums were not Chinese dot. They came from a ship approaching under a flag that had not yet crested the horizon. He could not see it yet, but he knew. He felt it in the wind. Something had arrived in Canton's waters that would not be washed away. Iron against paper, the British warship arrived under a sky bruised with stormlight, its silhouette rising from the horizon like something carved from iron and certainty. Canton slowed to watch it enter the river, its hull dark and unyielding, its masts towering above the smaller vessels that scattered in its path. No cannon fired. No banners waved. But the message was unmistakable. Britain had come not to negotiate, but to measure the empire that had dared to destroy its goods. On the riverbank, Lin Zexu watched in stillness. The drums he heard the night before echoed again, rolling across the water like thunder that refused to die. Around him, officers shifted uneasily. Soldiers whispered that these ships did not need wind, that their guns could fire faster than arrows could be loosed. Lin said nothing, but deep within, a quiet realization began to take shape. China was facing a storm it had not prepared for. The ship anchored near the foreign factories. Its crew moved with disciplined precision, ropes thrown, anchors dropped, planks lowered. Then a man stepped onto the wharf, broad-shouldered, uniform immaculate, expression carved from something colder than stone. Captain Charles Elliot, Her Majesty's representative in China, had arrived. The foreign merchants gathered to greet him with the frantic relief of men who believed salvation had finally taken form. But Elliot did not greet them warmly. He studied their faces as if weighing their failures. Only then did he speak, his voice clipped and controlled. "You have surrendered British property," he said, "and you did so without authorization. Do you understand the implications?" The merchants tried to explain, stumbling over their words. They spoke of being trapped, of Chinese pressure, of fear that Lin would imprison them. Elliot listened with an expression that betrayed nothing. When they finished, he simply turned his gaze toward the direction of Hummen, where the last of the opium still dissolved into the river water. "Then we have been insulted," he said, "and Britain will answer." News of Elliot's declaration spread through Canton faster than smoke on a dry wind. Chinese officials hurried through corridors, whispering warnings. Villagers stared at the foreign ship from the riverbanks, wondering why its presence felt heavier than the others. Soldiers reinforced gates and checkpoints, though many knew the weapons they carried were no match for what that ship held within its belly. Lin Zexu remained composed. Outwardly, he continued the paperwork of governance, issued commands to maintain order, and prepared reports for Beijing. But each night he returned to the river, watching the British vessel as if it were a storm cloud refusing to move. Elliot, meanwhile, sent dispatches upriver and messages to foreign merchant fleets waiting offshore. Britain's anger had found its shape. Soldiers sharpened their bayonets. Powder was inspected. And in the quiet of his cabin, Elliot wrote a single sentence that would be carried across oceans. "China has challenged the honor of the crown." The clash did not begin with cannon fire. It began with words carried between Elliot and Lin, like arrows shot from opposite worlds. Their first meeting was held aboard the British ship. Lin refused to step onto foreign soil, so the conversation took place across a narrow gangplank, the river churning beneath them. Elliot demanded compensation for the destroyed opium. Lin countered that China would not pay for its own suffering. Elliot insisted the traders acted under duress. Lin replied that they acted under justice. Neither man raised his voice, but the air between them crackled with the friction of two nations moving toward collision. Then Elliot leaned forward, his tone cooling further. "If you do not compensate us," he said, We will take repayment by force. Lin held his gaze. If your nation brings war to these waters, it will be remembered through generations. The words hovered, suspended like a blade, for a moment. Elliot's expression flickered not doubt, but calculation. Then he turned away, ending the conversation. The gangplank was withdrawn. The river rocked beneath their feet, and Lin stepped back onto Chinese soil, knowing that the bridge between their worlds had just been severed. The first spark came at the mouth of the Pearl River. British ship attempted to sail upriver without permission. Chinese junks moved to block its path. Their hulls were wooden, their sails patched from years of repair, their cannons old enough to belong in a museum. But the sailors aboard them did not retreat. They shouted warnings, raised flags, fired a single signal shot into the sky, and the British answered with thunder. A cannon erupted from the warship side, the blast shaking the air. The nearest junk splintered in two, its mast snapping like a reed. Sailors screamed as they plunged into the water, the river swallowing them as smoke rolled across the waves. Onshore, villagers watched in stunned silence. They had expected foreign ships to be dangerous, but not devastating. Not like this. The river had become a battlefield in the span of a breath. Elliot stood at the ship's bow, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the smoking wreck. Behind him, another officer whispered, "Sir, this will escalate." "It already has," Elliot replied. When news of the skirmish reached Lin Zexu, he read the report with steady hands, but his eyes darkened. The scale of British firepower was worse than he expected. Worse than anyone in Beijing understood. He needed time to warn the emperor. Time to strengthen defenses. Time to prepare a nation that did not know it was about to step into its most devastating century. But time was the one thing Britain would not give. Within days, more British ships gathered at the river's mouth. Their masts formed a forest of shadow and authority. Their cannons were rolled into place, black mouths aimed at China's coast. Inside the foreign factories, merchants packed their belongings with trembling fingers, sensing the tide of history shifting beneath their feet. Lin requested another audience with the British. Elliot refused. He had already drafted a proclamation to British subjects, declaring that hostilities were now imminent and self-defense necessary. China had destroyed property. China had seized British goods. China had fired upon a British ship. The narrative was set. But there was a detail the merchants whispered among themselves, a detail that Elliot already suspected, but had not yet confronted aloud. The emperor of China had ordered all foreign nations to cease the opium trade. But Britain was not acting solely to avenge confiscated goods. It was acting to enforce dominance, to open markets, to reshape Asia in its image. This war was not about drugs. It was about power. Lin knew this before most of his own court did. And yet, as evening fell on Canton, lanterns flickering against the river's edge, he received a final letter, one that made his breath catch. It was from Beijing. From the emperor himself. The tone was different this time. Fear bled through the brushstrokes. Rumors had reached the capital of British ships, unlike anything China possessed. The court urged caution, urged restraint, urged negotiation. But in the final line, barely visible in the fading ink, the emperor wrote something that hollowed Lin's chest. If the foreign devils seek war, avoid it. We are not ready. Lin stood at the open window long after reading the letter, the night wind stirring the lamps. Below, the river glowed faintly under the moon. Indifferent to human ambition. China was not ready. And Britain was already here. He closed his eyes, hearing distant cannon crews preparing their guns, feeling the tremor of a world about to shatter. Then, from the harbor, a flare shot into the sky, bright white, rising in a perfect arc, a signal from the British. Fleet thought something was beginning, something that could no longer be stopped. The poisoned future. The night the British flare rose above Canton, it painted the sky in a cold, white shimmer that pressed itself onto the river and the city like frost. People stepped out of their homes and stared upward, unsure whether they were witnessing a signal, a warning, or the beginning of something far worse. The flare lingered, then faded, but its afterglow carved a line through every heart that saw it. Lin Zexu stood at the highest balcony of the Governor-General's residence, robes stirring in the rising wind. He had watched the flare's arc from beginning to end. He understood its meaning long before the echo of its launch reached the shore. Britain had made its decision. Diplomacy had dissolved, just as surely as the opium at Hummen had dissolved into the river. Behind Lin, an aide entered, voice tight with fear. British troops were gathering at the river mouth. Steamers were preparing to move. More ships were arriving sleek, dark silhouettes slipping past the horizon like silent predators. Lin gave a single nod. Nothing surprised him anymore, but each detail tightened a knot in his chest. He dismissed the aide and continued watching the water, counting the vessels by the dim glow of their lanterns. Their number grew with each hour. One ship had been intimidation. A fleet was a declaration. At dawn, the British moved. The first cannon fired as the sun broke over the river. The blast rolled across the city, sending birds spiraling into the sky. Chinese junks scrambled to position themselves, their sailors shouting orders that were swallowed by the roar of engines and gunfire. The river churned with smoke before the first British shell struck. The impact cleaved through the wooden hull of a river fort, scattering splinters like arrows. Soldiers scrambled onto the battlements, firing muskets that fell short of the enemy ships. They watched in helpless disbelief as British steamers glided forward unstoppable, untouched by wind closing the distance with unnerving precision. One gunboat advanced too close to a junk, and the Chinese sailors seized the moment. They hurled grappling hooks, pulling the vessels together. For a heartbeat, it felt as though courage might shift the tide. Men leapt aboard the enemy deck, weapons raised. Then a second British cannon fired at near point-blank range. The explosion threw bodies into the river. The junk split open, swallowed by the waves. The British deckhands watched the scene without celebration. For some, victory felt strangely hollow. For others, it was just another step they had been ordered to take. Along the shoreline, villagers huddled behind stone walls, watching smoke coil upward like black serpents. A mother clutched her child, whispering prayers she barely remembered. A fisherman dropped his nets and ran inland, convinced the sea itself had turned violent. In the marketplace, rumors churned as quickly as the river current. Some claimed the British had dragons hidden inside their ships. Others spoke of iron armor impenetrable by blades. A few insisted that China could still win, though they whispered it with uncertainty. Lin Zexu moved through the chaos like a man pushing against a rising tide. He issued orders to reinforce positions, to evacuate civilians, to repair damaged forts. But he could see the truth more clearly than the smoke drifting from the riverbanks. China was fighting a war with paper shields. News reached Beijing within a week, fragmented, panicked, wrapped in layers of bureaucratic polish that attempted to soften the disaster. Court officials argued in hushed tones. Some called for retreat. Others demanded the execution of every foreigner in Canton. The emperor listened from behind his veiled screen, face pale, fingers clutching the armrest carved with dragons. Lin's name echoed through the hall, sometimes as a hero, sometimes as the man who had provoked catastrophe. But the emperor, torn between fear and pride, could not act decisively. Messages were sent, then countermanded. Strategies proposed, then abandoned. The palace shifted like a boat caught between currents. And all the while, reports from the south grew darker. In Canton, British forces advanced upriver, dismantling forts with brutal efficiency. Chinese cannon crews fired until their guns overheated, but most projectiles splashed harmlessly into the water. The gap in firepower was impossible to ignore. Soldiers who had once marched with confidence now stood trembling behind walls, praying for miracles. At the Haizhou fort, a commander named Feng Gaoyuan, an old soldier, hardened by years of border, skirmishes climbed the ramparts as British ships approached. Sweat dripped down the side of his face. He barked orders until his voice cracked, urging his men to hold the line. When the first British shell struck the fort's gate, he did not flinch. When the second tore through the parapet, showering him with stone fragments, he spat dust and steadied his stance. "Fire again," he shouted. "As long as you stand, fire." But the cannons misfired. Gunpowder was damp. The British guns were faster, hotter, louder. By midday, the fort's walls crumbled, sending soldiers tumbling. Feng refused to retreat. He lifted a musket, aimed at the nearest ship, and fired. The shot vanished in the wind. The British guns answered with a roar that shook the earth beneath him. When smoke cleared, the fort was broken, its defenders scattered, its banner torn and hanging by a single thread. The British ships sailed onward. Lin Zexu witnessed the aftermath with a heaviness that settled deep into his bones. He walked through the remains of the fort-burned earth, cracked walls, abandoned rifles, and felt the full weight of what the empire was facing. One surviving soldier sat against the rubble, blood trickling down his arm. He looked up at Lin with eyes glazed by exhaustion. "We fired until the barrels split," he murmured. "They didn't even slow." Lin knelt beside him, not as an official, but as a man sharing the burden of defeat. "Your courage will be remembered," he said quietly. Several other soldiers approached, their expressions torn between shame and fear. One spoke hesitantly. "Commissioner, will reinforcements come?" Lin paused. The truth lodged in his throat. He lifted his eyes toward the north, toward Beijing, toward an emperor trapped in indecision. And he knew the answer. Not soon enough. As British ships continued their push, the foreign factories were abandoned by panicked merchants, their windows shattered, their walls scarred by musket fire. The streets emptied. Canton became a city of echoes, doors slamming shut, guards scrambling toward failing defenses, civilians rushing inland with what little they could carry. British officers took note of every detail. They marked river channels, mapped fort positions, studied the city's layout. Their commanders met aboard the flagship, discussing how far they could push before negotiations would favor them. And still, somewhere deep in the city, a flicker of hope remained. Lin Zexu received a message from a distant governor. Troops were being sent. Supplies were gathering. Reinforcements would arrive. It was the first good news he had heard in weeks. But before he could finish reading the message, another messenger burst into the chamber, breathless dirt smeared across his face. "Commissioner Lin," he gasped, "a new British ship has entered the river. Larger than the others, faster." Lin stood slowly. The messenger shook his head, eyes wide with something close to terror. "It's a steam warship, sir. All iron, no sails. Nothing we have can stop it." The room fell silent. Outside, thunder rumbled not from the sky, but from the river. Lin moved to the balcony, heart pounding as he listened to the steady thump of engines approaching, the sound unlike anything China had ever faced. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of coal and salt and steel. The river began to glow with reflected firelight as the shape of the warship emerged through the mist dark, powerful, slicing through the water with a confidence that felt almost alive. And with it came the realization that the battle for Canton was no longer one of strategy or courage. It was a battle against time. Lin gripped the railing, breath tight in his chest, because behind that ship, barely visible in the rising light, another silhouette approached. An even larger vessel. And whatever it carried was about to change the war forever.